So Adam, this is what we're on to today.
Hey, yes, exactly.
Success.
Hurrah!
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. You've got the nice 3D paper version. Well, good stuff. The subtitle, if you're okay with that, I'll launch in at the subtitle. Why every leader needs to develop a creative mindset. One of the things that we've really learned in having conversations with authors is that, especially in business nonfiction, is that word choice really matters, and there's some value, not in like, an Aristotelian way, not really deep, but in defining some terms and understanding what's meant by some keywords. So the two that pop out there are leader and creative. But can you just sort of, with that prompt, can you kind of head into what, I suppose, something like what the question or the mission of the book is?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, you're right. The subtitle of the book, "Why Every Leader Needs to Develop a Creative Mindset," is really the question of why you should read the book. So to answer your question, I have to go back to why I started researching and writing this book in the first place 2 years ago. And the answer was, several years before that, I saw a couple of studies that intrigued me. And it reminded me of another academic who once said, "The reason I write articles or books is an attempt to answer a question I don't know the answer to. And it's intriguing enough that I'm willing to invest a lot of my time to try to figure out the answer." Because I think the best researchers, I think, are intensely curious people. And so these pieces of information that I saw a few years ago were as follows. One, a top 4 management consulting company, who shall remain nameless, did a survey of CEOs all around the world, asking them, what are your top 3 priorities? And creativity was a top 3 priority in 79% of the cases. So hundreds of CEOs, almost 80% of them, 4 out of 5 are saying creativity, top 3 priority. My business is all about being innovative, et cetera, et cetera. Simultaneously, second piece of information, another Big 4 management consulting company, unbeknownst to the first, did a survey, not of CEOs, but of the rank and file of employees all over the world, asking, how good is your company at creativity and innovation? Now, you know it's coming. 94% of those surveyed said, basically, we're crap at it. We're horrible. So you've got the vast majority of CEOs saying top priority, and the vast majority, even faster proportion of their employees saying, but we're really bad at it. The thing that hooked me there is, I'm not sure there's a bigger gap in the corporate world today between an aspiration and the reality. So I figured this is worthy of addressing. How do we enhance the creative capacity in organizations or teams? And then the reason, you also very accurately identified the word leader. And it's because if an organization is to enhance its creative capacity, if it's to change, to truly develop the innovative mindset, that has no hope of happening unless its leaders individually are personally willing to change, right? An organization has no hope of changing unless its leaders are personally willing to change. So we start with the leader. What can the leaders do in their habits, in their processes, in the way they lead teams, in the way they lead a meeting, et cetera, to enhance innovation, and in so doing, cascading the innovative mindset to the rest of the organization?
So is there an implication there, and maybe this is where we can sort of dig deeper on why the leaders, why them? Is there an implication that if leaders evince a creative ability, creative mindset, that creativity in the workplace is something learned by modeling? Or does it just mean that, well, we've got one, and they're not just an average one because there they are in a high and visible place, and now actually the rank and file are going to have to do the hard work you don't learn it by modeling, you learn it by, block and tackle and more gritty methods. What's your guidance there?
I lean more toward your first contention that an organization's culture is the sum of its shared behaviors. And who determines what behaviors are shared? The role models, which in many cases, if not most cases, are the leaders. And what I've learned in researching the book is that a big part of when creativity is practiced organically in organizations is there's an element of permission.
Yes,
so when you see permission being held back, it's often because people don't believe they have permission. And I say believe, but actually that's the reality. So a couple other interesting statistics that I encountered is well over half of employees globally think they don't have permission to be creative at work, right? And that creativity is not part of their job. And only about 30% of companies around the world, as one example of creativity, allow or enable their people to experiment as well. So a tiny minority of companies allow experimentation, and most employees, if you ask them, what's your gut feeling in terms of whether you have any permission to be creative, whether your job entails creativity, would say no, it doesn't. But we know that human beings are filled with the capacity for creativity and innovation. I mean, that is a true, that's not my contention. There have been academic studies, looking at, do we all as human beings, is creativity part of our nature? Is it part of what makes us human? And the answer is yes. The late Professor George Land, the professor of the University of Minnesota, studied children aged 3 to 5, trying to measure their creative genius. And guess what he found? 98% of them were creative geniuses. Fast forward to those same individuals in their 20s, and only 2% were assessed as creative geniuses. Exactly the reverse ratio of when they started. So they have the ability, they have the nature. We are all creative as human beings. So there's something about the nature of work, and more specifically, how it is managed, that stops us from being creative. And yes, it's probably school and a lot of other factors. But it's important for us to note that it's part of our inherent nature, which is an optimistic thought. So if leaders can manage to unlock a natural ability, then that could open the floodgates quite quickly for an organization to be adaptable, inspirational, and innovative.
Let's maybe go back to the root observation, which is that you had 2 studies by big, serious, legit organizations. One's cutting this way, one's cutting that way, and lo and behold, you get like a pretty obvious tension there.
Yeah.
How I guess in our prior interviews and discussions around creativity, something has come up which was defined as small c creativity, mini c creativity, and capital C creativity. And how can we know that folks mean the same thing in such a study? So somebody asks, is creativity important in your workplace? And one of them is thinking, well, yes, because creativity is where brand new sensational products that carry us for a decade come from. And the other person says no, because they're envisioning, creative ways of reorienting the wire in a paperclip to make a cute animal. And so they both unfortunately get tagged with the same word, and you could get opposite answers because people are thinking about this word differently.
Yeah. So I think really when we talk about creativity, we have to paint it with a pretty broad brush. So, basically, if an organization is creative, if its organizational capacity is creative, any individual in that organization can legitimately, without prompting, say, I can pursue a new idea, whether it's tweaking an existing fit process or product or service or strategy or way of managing, whatever that might be. If they say that I have some permission to experiment, to play, to be curious, then that organization is I would argue is creative, because I think there are three main criteria for how would you actually know. One is that, like, do I have permission to be curious and to try new things? How many people have to say yes before I can try that new thing? And obviously it's an inverse ratio. The fewer people that have to say yes, the more
Great.
that metric is yes, you're a more creative organization. Second would be, how easy is it to get a little bit of resource, not millions, a little bit of time or a little bit of coin to maybe build a prototype or to run an experiment for a week, just something like that. How easy is it for that? That's the other criterion. Third criterion, this comes back to leadership, is everyone who manages others, do they personally have a KPI in their set of objectives that your part of your job is to enhance innovation in your team? Because if the managers don't have it in their objectives, and in many cases might think, actually, if I were to do that, it's anti my role, then of course their team is not going to be creative either. So they have to have a personal stake in the game. Otherwise, you cannot hope that the rest of the organization can somehow be innovative, because then there's an inherent tension among the ranks in the organization.
This is okay. Super. This is one of the paths I wanted to go down with you. So conventional thinking and habit in a workplace, a paid workplace, could be nicely encapsulated in SMART objectives, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time bound. And especially something like a KPI or a quarterly goal or a target. You almost couldn't think of a more antithetical anthem against creativity, which sometimes needs this word permission or the ability to suffer some waste. You have to head off on things that aren't measurable or they aren't specific because you don't know what the destination is yet. There's often one of the great tensions, Adam, would be a time boundedness. It's like, look, we don't know exactly what we're going to come up with. We're not certain how long it will take, but we know that when we do this kind of a discipline, we often end up with the new thing, the valuable thing, the thing that will unlock the future for us. So what has to happen? I guess my question is, what has to happen inside that KPI process or that wiring against things like measurability and time boundedness?
I think the barrier, the boundaries have to be very broad, because no individual in an organization, including its CXOs, can have any hope of knowing where an innovation will go if you extrapolate it to its ultimate destination. So the problem sometimes is organizations work too quickly to say, when would this be implemented? What's the ROI? What's the IRR against all of our other projects? It's, et cetera. And so all these innovations are quickly killed because the organization places a penalty on the ROI, the IRR, because it's unknown. And so, of course, any status quo project is going to get more resource because it's more certain. But the problem is, because it's status quo, people who are managing those projects or products or services are saying, look, give me just $1 million more, right? And I will increase the return on that, on sales by 0.75%. And the organization goes, oh, that's a good ROI, right? All we have to do is give you $1 million and you're giving us less than 1%, but it's so worth it. But of course, what happens is the organization as a whole, when you add up all those decisions, those myriad decisions, the organization's progress and innovation becomes marginal, becomes incremental. It becomes, tiny, tiny steps. You don't have any supernova ideas. You don't have any game changer ideas. You don't have any blue ocean strategies, because the organization places a premium on precedent. Let's simply exploit what we know. And let's put a huge discount on the time that we would give to consider and the resources that we would invest in wholly new ideas. And then when these kind of annual surveys come up, why does the organization lament that they aren't creative? You've created the conditions by which you are not with all of these daily decisions. And that's one of the things that I noticed. And two, because I don't want to make this job harder than it is. Because I imagine a leader, might be listening to this and going, well, it's such a big thing. How can I possibly move planets and stars in order to be creative? Well, actually,
Yeah.
go back to this example I just gave. It's lots of micro habits and tiny decisions that you make every day, which collectively have an overweighted exponential difference in the organization over time. So I'm very optimistic about this, that if leaders individually make subtly different choices, that can have a huge difference.
What do you think is the role of outsiders? I'm thinking like consultants, coaches, they just external voices
Yeah.
in affecting a change like the one that you're talking about,
Mhm.
given just how strong inertia can be.
Yeah. Well, for that very reason, because inertia can be so strong, I think that external perspective is hugely valuable, actually. So getting someone in to put with their external lenses to go, do you realize that this is happening? Have you noticed how you're suddenly kind of killing every new idea that occurs in the organization, et cetera, et cetera? Often an organization can go for months, years, decades, not recognizing that. Having the external perspective is hugely important. It reminds me of, often when I talk about creativity and innovation with leaders and organizations, they say, oh, we've been trying to crack this intractable problem for years. And I say, okay, tell me how you've tried to crack this intractable problem. And it basically boils down to, they give me some version of, well, we meet regularly in the same beige boardroom with the same faces, asking the same question, meeting after meeting, and we just haven't cracked it. Instead, okay, well then maybe you need to change the people involved in the conversation, change the environment in which you're having discussion, change the criteria and the questions. And often you can accelerate that by having a coach, a consultant, a mentor, etc. It reminds me, if I could just go down a rabbit hole for just a moment,
Yeah.
Whose line? Not whose lines anyway. I have improv in my mind because that's one of my chapters in the book. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? In the game show, everyone knows Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? You have 3 lifelines. You've got 50-50, ask the audience, phone a friend. And if you watch that game often enough, most contestants will hold most dearly the lifeline of phone a friend, right? They save that for the end, for the hardest questions. That's their sacred lifeline, right? When I'm really in trouble, I'm going to use the phone a friend. But think about it. Friend is one person. What are the odds that one person is going to have the answer to any possible question that could come up? Why? Because we know that person. So we trust that person. And so we ignore the limitations of their knowledge and their imagination. The most valuable lifeline, and I have looked at 2 academic papers from PhD mathematicians who have studied Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And of course, they would tell you the most valuable lifeline, the smallest error probability, right? In other words, the contestant gets it wrong less often, is ask the audience, right? If you go with the number one answer that the majority of the audience selected, you only have something like only a 6% chance of getting the question wrong over all the years of Wants to Be a Millionaire. But contestants throw that one away right off the bat because they don't know the audience. They're strangers. What do they know? They're idiots, right? Even though there are 100 of them. All these different external perspectives who have experiences and education and degrees that you do not. And yet you hold dear this one person that you know. So the same is true in teams when we talk about creativity and innovation. Because I know and trust and I work with these people around me on a daily basis, I expect somehow that I can be more creative with them instead of injecting a different perspective.
So I imagine that what's comfortable. You just belittled the beige boardroom, but I imagine that there's something to that, which is that that's the known place, that's the comfortable place,
Yeah.
and that, like, we'll take the extreme opposite, a caricature, right? You get some sort of like drama major comes in here with a clown nose on and is like, let's be creative today. Like, there's no credibility, there's no ethos there for me to say you understand my world and what's at stake. I understand creativity is valuable, but what I need is somebody who gets my milieu and context. So the characters we're talking about have to be, Adam Kingl could go in with his sort of his authorship and his experience and credentials, and people are like, all right, you're welcome here in a boardroom because you can speak both languages. But are there enough Adam Kingls for the task?
It's a great question, because I think a lot of creativity either is too complicated in its approach. Like literature on research on creativity is just overly complicated. And actually, creativity as an academic field, I think there are a lot of books and whatnot on being creative, et cetera, or biographies, autobiographies on paragons of creativity, but not a lot actually in academia, for example, in peer-reviewed journals on things like creativity and innovation, funny enough. And so, no, I don't think there probably are enough people who can legitimately kind of straddle the worlds. But, can I come back to the point you made about, like, so we're not going to bring in Bozo the clown, right, to teach us creativity, because Bozo
Yes.
doesn't have credibility. Well, that's true. However, the methodology by which I identified some of the micro habits that leaders can adopt in the book have come largely from leaders that I observed and interviewed in creative arts, right? Because of course you have to think, well, I'm not trying to say I'm consulting to an accounting firm. I'm not trying to turn them into Disney. But
Yes.
it might be helpful for me to go in and observe leaders at Disney and see how they lead a team, what kind of conversations they have, how they prioritize their time, and then translate that for the accounting firm. So to that extent, I think we can learn a lot from creative individuals whose context is completely different from ours.
Yeah.
Because these are behaviors, ultimately, is what I'm talking about. So actually, that's what I did in most chapters of the book, is I actually took a creative field like painting or culinary arts or theater, and said, well, what have I observed in those leaders in terms of how they do these things, how they interact with people, how they foster ideas, how they generate ideas. But then I went further and I identified organizations and leaders in organizations in so-called traditional industries who are doing the same thing. So that the reader can't go, oh, well, it's all fine and good for you to say this is what this Michelin star chef does, but I'm not a chef. I'm running an accounting firm. I can't do that. Well, actually, I have an examples of, managers of warehouses and electronics, etc. So yes, actually, people can do these things. It isn't about the context. It's about the behavior. Because I wanted to kill the idea that we can't look at creative fields because that's not our industry. When we're talking about realistic steps that leaders can take on a daily basis. Sure, strategies might be different, cultures might be different, but leadership behaviors to move the organizational needle forward on adaptability, inspiration, innovation, those, my contention, my hypothesis was, those are probably could be universally held in practice to great, to positive results. And turns out it is, I think.
Can I ask you about adaptability? I'm not certain that everybody will immediately know the connection.
Yeah, I think adaptability is a creative act, right? Because
Yes.
it's asking you to change any number of things, our strategy, or me personally, or recognizing and pivoting to our context. Maybe the market has changed. Maybe there's a new competitor. In some ways, we are all constantly asked to adapt. And I don't think there will be a single viewer or listener today who was watching this who would say, "Oh, my organization adapts all the time. Very easy. We adapt like that. No problem." No, of course, organizations are typically very poor at adapting because we have come from decades of books and consultants saying, the organization has plenty of time to adapt. Then you unfreeze and you do some tweaks and changes, and then you can refreeze, and then you can relax, right? Set yourself back in the warm bath of the status quo. You successfully managed change. Thank God we don't have to confront that again for a decade. Well, actually, I think change today is constant. We constantly have to be looking at what's happening and constantly acting and reacting based on what we're seeing. So I think adaptability is a different practice today. It has to be more reflexive and automatic and autonomic, where we can just do it. It's like, for example, if you see someone you're attracted to, your pupils dilate, right? They go whoosh, they get bigger. You can't help it. It just happens. That's an organism, right? That's chemistry. That's biological chemistry. Well, the same I think has to be true in organizations. We have to create more of a reflexive ability to say, something's happening, act or react, and you can do it. And it might still mean you're experimenting, you don't know the answer, but you jump in. You don't create a 5-year plan, which has to be cascaded and take, years, eons for people to even get what you're trying to do, let alone your colleagues actually doing something different. And part of the problem too is I think leaders sometimes are good about saying we have to change, but they're very poor about executing change throughout the organization. Some of that is how they communicate, and some of it is they haven't enabled the capacity in the people in the rank and file of the organization to be able to change quickly.
Yeah.
And that again is behaviors that leaders can start to role model and therefore change the culture.
You've done so much thinking and writing on the intergenerational dynamics. What's the overlay there? I mean, we touched on one piece of the overlay, which is that if you can begin with the leadership, then you get the modeling effect. But between generations, how does creativity, innovation, adaptability plug in?
Yeah. Well, so yes, you're right. 3 years ago, I wrote a book called Next Generation Leadership, which is all about the different generations, and I was and how their views about life, work, careers, leadership. And I did a very deep dive in the youngest generations in the workforce, Gen Y or millennials, which is actually in a couple of years will be 75% of the global workforce. So I think if you don't understand this generation, then you don't understand your employees, kind of full stop. But also started to peer into Gen Z or Gen Z, right, who are just starting to enter the workforce. And if I apply what I learned there to what I've learned about creativity and innovation in the book Spark and Success, I mean, one thing I have to remind myself is that my original contention, which is that every human being has a natural capacity for being creative. It's part of being human. So yes, over time, we might say, I become less creative. You don't lose the inherent capacity to be creative as you get older, but you could be conditioned or trained to think that you're less creative, and therefore the way you be is less creative. But part of that also has to do with how too many organizations define management. So if you think of the word to manage, and if I were to open up a thesaurus and find the word manage, find the first synonym, right, which is going to be the most common synonym in that whatever language on the planet, in the vast majority of cases, the first synonym I will find for manage is control. To manage equals to control. If you think about the implications of that word, control means my job as a manager is to say no. My job as a manager is to keep control, to hold things down, to prevent instead of to enable, to make more relevant, to empower, to adapt, which I
Yeah.
think is really what we need from managers today. And even if we say it, and even if we learn it, doing MBAs, whatnot, as soon as we enter the culture of an organization, we quickly learn, consciously or unconsciously, if I become a manager, my job is to say no. And of course, then those leaders say, they lament, oh, we're not a creative company. No one comes to me anymore with new ideas. And I have to ask, well, how often do you say no when someone comes to you with a new idea? And if the answer is the vast majority of the time, why are you surprised that no one is coming up to you with new ideas anymore? You've conditioned people to say, not your job, not your concern, don't worry about it, right? And then their pushback is, yeah, but Adam, I can't implement and execute every idea someone comes up with. I agree with you, but explore the damn idea for a little bit, right?
Yeah, great.
Acknowledge the other person, value their thinking, and just spend a few seconds. It doesn't even have to be 4 hours. Give them a few seconds more time to let's just explore this. Let's just see what might be some benefits if we were to apply the idea. It doesn't mean then because you gave them 30 more seconds of your day, you then have to execute the idea. But for gosh sakes, what most managers do is they automatically, speaking of autonomic behaviors, they automatically say no. My job is to say no. So the reason your organization then is not creative has nothing to do with your people. It's your people reacting to how you respond to creativity. And this is again why we have to start. I start from leadership in terms of enhancing creative capacity in organizations.
That's great stuff. As you were saying it, I was just reflecting on some of the readings and discussions that we've had on the theme of creativity. One of the remarkable paradoxes, and this is maybe a let's say a path for that somewhat rigid manager. One of the remarkable paradoxes is in the early divergent thinking stage of a creative process, if you give people parameters, so it's not saying no, don't get going, but if you actually restrict the parameters, it's like, I need you to write a haiku poem and it has to include the word architect, and and it has to also feature sage plant. Like suddenly you get much better results than if you just say write a free verse poem of any kind. It doesn't matter what it is.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's right.
So I think there's an opportunity there where let's say someone in leadership who's concerned about the wishy-washy Bozo the Clown version of creativity can say, in their business unit, I need you to come up with a brand new product. It has to have an 80% profit margin and, be able to roll out in 4 languages.
Right.
And they'll get a better result than just, I need you to come up with fresh ideas.
Yeah. But too often leaders say that I have to do it. I have to come up with a big idea. It's so much pressure. I can't sleep at night.
Right.
Instead of going back to the lifeline, ask the audience. Outsource it or crowdsource it and see what you get. Yeah, absolutely. A few parameters enhance. That is the paradox. You're right. A few parameters can enhance creativity, not restrict it. The great composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein once said, to get a great idea, 2 things are needed. A plan and not quite enough time. So Chris is making the point that, actually having that restriction kind of focuses the mind. And then you actually can make great things happen, because after a while, if you just say no limits, do whatever you want, etc., after a while that actually can freeze people. They're like, it's just too big. I don't know what to do without any parameters, without any borders, without any time or budget or what have you. This is also why prototyping is so useful, right? Because prototyping starts to allow you to test whether you are meeting the parameters and the brief. So, we have to, as quickly as possible, make things real, not just, theoretical conversations. So rather, what would be the difference? And of course, it depends on what the question is, but what difference would it make if a manager said, instead of come to our next meeting with ideas about ABC and then give the parameters, but to say, come to our next meeting with prototypes, even if they're completely rough and ready, like made of cardboard, or using the simplest code you can possibly learn, whatever it is,
Yes.
right? Just so we can play with it. And once you make it real, then it's much more likely that you'll be able to extrapolate the benefits and the limitations of that idea. One of the people that I interviewed in Sparking Success is the creative and managing director of Carnegie Hall in New York City. And isn't this interesting? His title is creative and managing director. So he
Lovely.
straddles the creative world, and that's very rare, even in creative arts organizations. And that's his maxim, basically, is make it real as quickly as possible. We don't know if we're onto something. I could share with you endlessly ideas like they created a National Youth Orchestra of the United States, was started by Carnegie Hall. But he said, I could talk ad infinitum about a youth orchestra of the United States. But I'm not going to get investment. I'm not going to get donors to put money into that idea. But once I can show them what it will be like, if I can just get enough resource to maybe do one concert, then either the floodgates open and you're onto something, or you quickly learn, okay, that wasn't a very good idea, but we didn't invest that much to begin with. It was a prototype. We did a one-off, one performance, with a national youth orchestra, with a youth orchestra. But make it real as soon as possible.
I want to go back to a word that I think is kind of dear to you, but maybe like just a really interesting sandbox, which is improv. You mentioned improv.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me, just tell me about improv, Adam.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, most chapters in Sparking Success is looking at a creative field and learning about micro habits. And I think improv, and jazz is in the same chapter, is really useful because in improv are techniques about human interaction of one person to another, how you speak, how you show up, how you set up a conversation, right? That's all improv. So it is probably one of the most easily applicable in any business context. You go, okay, I could see how I can use that. I don't have to do many acrobatics to help, versus like culinary arts. Improv, very, very easy, because they're often verbal things, right, that one can do. So one of the people that I interviewed is Neil Malarkey. And if you don't know that name, Neil Malarkey, you should, because he is the co-founder of the Comedy Store Players, which is kind of the original improv club just off Leicester Square in London. And I say co-founder because his other co-founder is a little-known actor named Mike Myers, maybe or you may not have heard of. So Neil and Mike actually started the Comedy Store Players. They met at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And so, and of course, that created seminal pieces of entertainment around improv, like Whose Line Is It Anyway? And Neil, funny enough, has also studied as an executive coach, and he facilitates business fora on things like pitching, selling, being more collaborative, being more creative, etc. And I, funny enough, another reason this is near and dear to my heart is I did improv. So my original career is I worked in theater, film, and television. And as part of that world, kind of for fun, I performed in and directed in improv groups, both in the US and in the UK. So, I was very simpatico with Neil when I interviewed him. And we discovered, even though we have never done improv together, is that our toolkit and our vocabulary is nearly identical. Because some things you just know work, right? And over time, and many people practicing improv, these things you start to converge on the truth in terms of what works and actually what doesn't. So, for example, one of the best verbal habits that Neil and I have both practiced, independent of each other, is the copious use of the phrase "yes and." So what I mean by that is, the most common phrase you hear in an office, if you're to record every conversation in your office, not your office, Kevin, but any other office in an office over a day, probably the most common phrase you will hear is yes, but, right? Because management as controlism, my job is to say no to as much as possible. Yes, but is the polite way to say no. Worse though, it's yes, but is the polite way to say, be quiet, shut up, sit down, know your role, etc. Leave my office, I'm busy. It's even worse. Even worse than yes, but is with respect. Then you know you're in trouble. Then you know your job's on the line. If someone says that, with the greatest respect, start packing your desk now. Right? It's over.
Yeah.
So, yes, and goes back to the idea I mentioned before: is you give the other person permission to explore their idea, even if it's for half a minute. Like someone says, "Oh, have we ever thought about blah, blah, blah?" Oh, yes. And if we did that, maybe this would happen, this would happen. Let's just talk about that, right, for a few minutes. And yes, and if we implemented it, we could get this person involved. And I know they would be really excited about that, etc. And yes, there's a time later to go, okay, what are the concerns we have about this idea? But if you start from the perspective of building on the idea, you will get a volume of ideas over time, a much greater volume of ideas of people proactively coming to you with new ideas. So to give an example of how well this works, I facilitated a workshop with Richard Heitner, who is a faculty member at London Business School, and he used to be the worldwide deputy chairman of Saatchi & Saatchi, right? A paragon of a creative media agency. So he and I co-facilitated a workshop of the executive committee of a Southern Hemisphere mining services company, okay? So this is as traditional as it gets, right? And over the week, we covered lots of different things, lots of different topics, strategy, leadership, you name it. One of the things we covered in that week, and it was only for about 20 minutes. So this was not the majority of the week by any means. About 20 minutes, we talked about yes, but versus yes, and, as a, change your verbal habit from yes, but to yes, and. And that, by the way, that is a maxim of improv, to say yes and, never say yes but, always yes and. Okay, like if someone says something, then that's the truth, and your job is to build on it. Watch any good improv scene. That's what they're doing. Even if they're not saying yes and, that's what they're doing.
Right.
So we were actually saying, because these people had never done this before, we said, try to repress saying yes but and say yes and instead, and just see what will happen. Okay, and just do it. And so at the end of the week with the exco, they said, okay, let's make some action plans. What are we absolutely committing to do? Well, of course, yes and was at the top of the list because it was a simple thing to do, right? It required no investment, no time. It's just like for a couple of weeks, we're just going to try to yes and more often and say yes, but a whole lot less often. About a week after that workshop ended, I went back and I talked to the direct reports of that executive committee in this mining services company. And action was like, what have you done to them? Like, they're completely different people. I don't know these, I don't recognize these people anymore. They're open, they're optimistic, they're supportive, they're like, and funny enough, they didn't know what the difference was. They didn't identify the difference, but they immediately felt it. And the only thing that was happening differently is they were saying yes and instead of yes but. But it had an overweighted effect, this tiny choice.
Right.
It's like dropping a pebble in a pond, right? The ripples were huge, though the stimulus, the change, was small. So this is, again, an improv maxim. It's like rule one of improv.
Yes.
That you can absolutely apply in business with little effort, and will absolutely, guaranteed, enhance an optimism for exploring new ideas in your organization.
So the micro habits, this is one of them. Yeah. They're not a climb up Everest. It sounds like, you've designed and articulated them in such a way that people aren't going to have to completely change their moorings in order to try them on and deploy them.
That's absolutely right. There's only one example I can think of a dramatic, like, personal reinvention. Because I wanted to at least give that, like, look, it does happen, etc. But the vast majority of the book, you're right. I have, it covers these little micro habits, and I intentionally use the word micro habits in order to make it, simple, applicable. And the good thing too is, again, doesn't require a lot of time, doesn't require a lot of investment to try it. There are tons of ideas, tons of micro habits suggested in the book. So try one, doesn't work, try another one. I'm not suggesting they're all going to work for every individual on the planet, but I would guarantee that 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of them will work for any individual on the planet. So
Yeah.
I would encourage
Yeah.
experimentation.
Well, and you put forward a definition of culture, which is some of its shared behaviors. I think something like yes, and or something else that's a micro habit, you can it's easier maybe to pull off as a team as opposed to just one little fish
Yeah,
swimming
right.
against the current. But
True.
I think you don't need to do a cultural overhaul, but if your definition of culture obtains, which is some of shared behaviors, a small change in language, for example, has a
Yeah.
lot of change
Yeah.
built in it.
There's a lot of merit to saying, not only will I personally try this micro habit, but I will encourage my team to do so. And then and then in a week's time, we'll regroup and we'll see if that's working for us or not. So yes, you're employing more people into practicing adaptability, and some of that may work, some of that may not. But you're right. Then if something works, you will be more certain of the positive effect that it works, because you're not the only person trying it. I could have just asked the CEO of this Antipodean mining services company to practice yes and more often, but because the whole exco promised to do it, the impact was noticeable faster. But it was time bound as well, right? If they say after 2 weeks or 1 week, if it's not working for one or more of them, then don't do it anymore. That's fine. But
Yeah.
but you're right. I have no issue. In fact, quite the reverse of employing other people in your journey to improve yourself, to adapt, right? Say, look, team, I'm going to be trying ABC for the next week. I would love your support. In fact, I would even love if you did this along with me. Absolutely. Because and yes, not everything is going to work. But in doing that act alone is improving the adaptive ability of the team, right? Because you're asking everyone to constantly try new things. Even just that act has benefit, even if the individual habit you are practicing and asking other people to practice isn't working for you. There are still these tangential benefits.
Adam, what do you? I think the way I want to ask this is, what do you advise when, say, an organization begins to take this on? They're going to go through a classic feature of the creative process, which is divergent thinking and then convergent thinking. They're going to have to cut. We talked about prototyping. So, 12 people are going to bring their dumb prototype into the room and be like, oh, well, here's my little wimwam. Well, we know that minimum 11 of those have to go on the cutting room floor. 11 of those have to get rejected. So I think there's a few questions in here. One is, what do you say about the volume of ideas for those who are on practice in this, like getting ready for the fact that we're going to have to come up with a dozen or 100, and then what comes after, which is we're also going to have to be comfortable and like relaxed and cheerful about the fact that 99 of these suckers are going to go nowhere. Right? That's
right.
So what's your guidance there?
Well, that's the reality, is my guidance, right? Well, if you study, you don't have to study creativity for a day and read some of the literature to know that creativity is a numbers game, right? The idea that a creative person sits on the mountaintop and then a bolt of lightning hits them with this one brilliant idea that's perfectly sculpted, and they implement it and they change the world is nonsense. So I've worked with people like Pixar Animation Studios, and their former managing director, Ed Catmull, said every script that Pixar develops in its first incarnation is terrible. Every single one is terrible. But we read a dozen scripts and we think one might have merit. So we'll develop it a little bit further. And then maybe over time, over iteration, it becomes, Toy Story or what have you, right? But
Wally.
But yeah, exactly. But don't sit there saying like that one idea is going to hit you like a bolt of lightning. You have to go through a volume of ideas. So that is an inevitable conclusion if you are committed to be running a creative team or a creative organization. Sorry, them's the breaks. You have to do that. And companies are bad at this, and they waste a lot of money as a result, right? They put a lot of money into these big launches, national launches, international launches, and most of those ideas fail because they're only brave enough to get behind a single idea that was proposed once in the boardroom, by someone that they trusted and that they knew, and so they put millions behind it. 80% of new product launches in FMCG fail within 2 years and are no longer on the shelf. That's 80% of millions of wasted dollars because of a lack of experimentation and prototyping. So that would be my first response to your question. The second is you have to be tolerant of failure. So 12 people come in the room. Your job as the leader is to let the other 11 down gently and encourage them to come back with more prototypes tomorrow.
Right.
That's important. How do you say no? Kindly and encouragingly. One of the people I interviewed as well, it was one of the head writers and showrunners, executive producers of the hit TV show Friends. And he said his main jobs was to encourage as many ideas as possible. So it wasn't to come up with great ideas himself, but was to foster as many, because he knew that everyone's going to come, 19 out of every 20 ideas coming out of every individual's mouth around the writing table is going to be poor. So my job is, how do I encourage 20 ideas from each person? Not, I don't want you to say anything until you come up with the great idea. It's not going to work.
Right.
So one technique he used, again, talking about micro habits, one technique he used was intentionally proposing himself bad ideas. So that he would then say it, and then think about it and go, oh, actually, there couldn't have been a worse idea than that. Well, that was a whopper of an idea. Let's move on. You've now given permission to everyone to go, oh, I'm not going to get shot down for proposing a bad idea. In fact, the boss might even chuckle and say, you'll hit a home run next time, slugger. Keep going at bat. So that would be the other thing I would say about, how do you kind of start to change the creative culture, is you have to be comfortable with bad ideas. You have to be comfortable with encouraging people to keep getting up to the plate.
There was a early boss that I had that instilled in me the idea of a very ugly draft, and it never got a different name. It was never like, the 60% draft or something nicer. It always was like the very ugly draft. But that surely helped to just sit down and throw something on the paper. And I don't know that it was like a full flowing creative process, but man, did that ever just willingly at the outset, as you said, having a very tolerant of failure posture at the start just meant that it was a lot of free space to just get something down.
Yeah. If people feel threatened to propose something new, they won't propose anything new. That's basically a law of human behavior.
We've been making a kind of a meta study, I think, Adam, as we've been speaking to authors. You're author 56 in our experiment now. Well, okay. You're a double. You get double counted, but there you are. And I think I want to put this question to you in the context of the book you've just written. It's a philosophical question, but the question is, what is a workplace? And there's something about that space, a workplace, where it's hostile to creativity or it's friendly to it, or somewhere on a spectrum of hostile to fostering. But what do you make of that? Because it strikes me that if we change the venue, and now it's creativity in your sports club, or creativity at home with your partner, or creativity at your church, and what have you, that's a different environment, but there's other things going on in the workplace.
Yeah, sure. Well, the workplace has a greater impetus or mandate to perform, to create value. But funny enough, I think we've made poor choices in terms of how do we dramatically enhance the value we contribute to the market and to the world, right? As we become very constrained in our choices and very limited in how we manage, being more relevant tomorrow than we are today. So, so the workplace has to move on that spectrum a little bit more toward being more curious, more playful, more encouraging. And we have to really move away from the industrial revolution definition of the workplace as, human beings are automatons, are robots. And I just need people to turn the screw 90 degrees, and then the next widget comes up and turn the screw 90 degrees. Because guess what? We now have robots who can do that. We don't need human beings to do that. What we need is initiative, adaptability, creativity, outside the box thinking from our people. But that means we have to rethink how we manage. So I think the demand on work has evolved hugely, but the practice of management has not. So what I'm trying to do is accelerate the practice of management's evolution to catch up with today's context of what a workplace has to be in order to create value at this rapid pace of change.
We have to leave it there. We have to leave it at an hour. It's such a great topic, Adam. I'm glad you're back on the market with a fresh piece of work.
I'm delighted.
If I could ask a favor, we'll send you an envelope that stamps back to Singapore with some maybe nameplates in it. If you could sign them, we'll pass a handful. Sure. We'll buy like a half a dozen or a dozen books and pass them to some leaders specifically in Southeast Asia.
I'd really appreciate that. Yeah, I would be delighted to do that. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, we learned this from Greg Buston, who was one of the great folks we interviewed, and he was like, Kevin, there's no point me sending you books. It's like costly for you, costly for me. Right. I'll send you some nameplates. You stick them in there. So we did it, and now we've discovered that's awesome. We can't do it obviously with every book. We're doing like a book a week, but there's some, and I think this is certainly one of them where if we can do that. So provide us your mailing address in case we don't have it. And we'll send you the plates. We'll send you the plates and an envelope back to us. And then we'll let Amazon do the work of shipping the actual books.
There you go. Flat 2, 107 Church Road, Richmond, TW10 6LS, UK.
Great, super. Is there anything else that we can do to help you build your practice, your work, your research?
Well, very good. Well, at the moment, obviously, this is the book is the thing that I would like to to promote and give it a good push, and I'm kind of completely focused on that. So anything you can do to put this conversation alongside, saying this whole conversation is about this book, so watch this, and then we encourage you to buy the book, would be great. Sometimes I've done other podcasts, other interviews where I've listened to the whole thing and said, it isn't clear that I actually have a book related to this conversation. So if a viewer wanted to go further or deeper, what would they do? So the more explicit you can make it, that would be really appreciated.
Well, there's one thing that comes to mind. Our job is to organize academies for companies and work alongside them. we did some work for a Canadian university at the end of last year, writing a course called Creativity and Curiosity. And so there's a young readership. This is a business school. And so there's a young readership who are already saying, we know that it matters. We need a course on this. But, you know, we gave a bibliography, and I think maybe us reaching out back to them and saying, there's something good from an author we really like and respect that's just come here, and share it with your students.
No, please do. It isn't by any chance Souder Business School, is it?
It's not Souder. No, it's Dillon School of Business.
Okay.
Yeah,
I only asked because I'm an adjunct at Souder. So
oh, fantastic. Well, they don't need any intro to you then. That's great. I'm pleased to hear that. I'll tell you another theme that's been coming up with certain topics. Business development, networking were two that were clear, is that there are a handful of people who are adjunct faculty who touch topics that the business schools still have not cracked. So it's extremely rare to find a business school that has a sales stream.
Right.
Whereas marketing was like enshrined decades ago.
Right.
And I find that shocking because by my lights, the one is actually the more rigorous discipline than the other. But in any case, and it's the same with something fundamental like networking. It's like, well, that's kind of a ethereal, loosey-goosey kind of a top. It's like, well, it's pretty fundamental in what we call business. So it's funny that it also hasn't been, you know, given its proper blessing. Creativity, folks don't quite know what to do with, but it's great to see schools starting to say we need it, because schools, well, they're upstream of culture generally, but they're upstream of business for sure. No,
definitely. You're starting to see it. You know, I think like actually London Business School has a couple of people who are studying networks, which is good. And in terms of creativity, of course, I would go toward, you know, Stanford and the D School. You know, they've got quite an evolved practice. But you're right, it's hard. You have to hunt for these pockets of excellence.
Yeah. Well, lovely. We also, of course, will share just the raw video with you to the extent you want to like use it, cut it, slice it, dice it any which way you want, and we'll post it ourselves. The team under Sharat's guidance has gotten very fast. So within 48 hours, you'll have the whole conversation and at least one clip. But I think
I heard. I was shocked. Yeah, that's super fast. Amazing. And of course, whenever you post anything, to tag me, and then I'll in turn share it on my social media for sure.
That's great. It's great to see you again, Adam.
And thank you for having me.
Congratulations on the new book. Godspeed on doing a whirlwind of interviews and podcasts and promos and stuff, and we'll do our part.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, take care.